My son pushed a flimsy plastic daisy across the table, its edges jagged and color nauseatingly bright. "Happy birthday, Dad," he murmured without meeting my eyes. My chest burned. I remembered how real daisies used to sway in Marjorie's garden, and how I'd laid her to rest beneath them. Now, he handed me a hollow imitation, as if decades of my sweat and sacrifice were worth nothing. The candlelight flickered, mocking me. In that instant, I understood his gift was a verdict: I was irrelevant, replaceable. And the next move, my move, would decide our fate. I grew up believing a man's worth was measured by the strength of his word and the steadiness of his hand. When Marjorie and I married, we scraped together every penny to buy a small plot of land on the edge of town. I still remember the day I dug the first post hole by hand, sweat and clay caking my arms. That house rose not on cedar beams or marble floors, but on stubborn resolve and the promise of something better for our son. Those early years were simple, but they were ours. Every morning, I'd rise before dawn, tie my worn work boots, and drive the tractor across dew-damp fields. I planted corn, tomatoes, and beans. Marjorie tended the garden flowers that lined our picket fence. By noon, I'd return home for Marjorie's chicken soup, rich with garlic and fresh herbs, and we'd sit on the porch, watching the sky shift colors. In the evenings, I'd hoist our little boy onto my shoulders and spin him around the yard until he squealed with delight. We built makeshift swings from rope and old tires, fashioned kites from newspaper scraps, and hunted tadpoles in the creek. I taught him how to skip stones, how to mend a torn shirt pocket, and, above all, how to treat people with dignity. A true measure of a man, I'd say, is how he treats someone who can't do him a thing in return. Weekends were reserved for family rituals. Saturday mornings meant pancakes, fluffy, golden round stacked high and drizzled with Marjorie's homemade strawberry syrup. Sundays were for church bells and community lunches, where we'd volunteer to serve pie or sweep the floors. My son learned to offer an extra helping to the lonely widow down the lane or to carry groceries for Mrs. Patel even when his friends jeered. Marjorie's gentle coaxing and my firm example made him quick with kindness, and we both beamed every time he showed that heart. I taught him to read the seasons in the sky. How a red dawn meant fair weather, but a pale glow warned of rain. I showed him which trees bore good nuts and which mushrooms could kill you. On clear nights, we'd lie on our backs, counting the constellations as Marjorie hummed lullabies. Our songs were worn but warm, passed down from her mother's lips before war and hardship stole half our youth. When our son turned 10, we surprised him with a second-hand bicycle. It was missing a reflector and the paint was chipped, but his grin made every scrape worth it. He rode it until the chain rattled loose, and I stayed up past midnight fixing it, oiling every joint and polishing the handlebars until they shone. "You're the best, Dad," he said, hugging me tight. I still can't hear that line without my chest tightening. As he grew into adolescence, I worried, like any father, about the pull of the world beyond our quiet life. There were parties where too many beers flowed, and late nights when his bed lay empty. But he always came home by dawn, eyes bright with apology and lessons learned the hard way. We talked, not lectured, about responsibility and the value of honest work. I never raised my voice. I trusted that respect and open ears would guide him better than anger. Marjorie stood beside me through every triumph and mistake. When I was laid up one winter with a busted knee, she managed the fields, the house, and my cranky mood without a complaint. I remember lying in bed, peeking out the window as she trudged through snowdrifts to check the hay for the goats, her shawl wrapped tight and her breath billowing in the frosty air. That winter, our son fetched water and split wood, stepping into my boots, with a little wobble, for tasks I'd always done. I watched them and felt a quiet pride. The holidays were our favorite. Thanksgiving meant roasting turkeys so large they nearly filled the oven, wrapping the house in cinnamon and nutmeg. Christmas brought creaky carols on the old upright piano, homemade gifts wrapped in brown paper and string. We placed a single sprig of holly on the mantel, always from Marjorie's garden, and lit a candle for those we'd lost. Under that candle's glow, our little family felt unbreakable. I worked hard, maybe too hard, but I never regretted it. By the time our son graduated high school, we'd paid off the mortgage, saved enough for his college tuition, and kept a few dollars aside for rainy days. He hugged me so tightly afterward I almost toppled backward. "I couldn't have done it without you," he whispered. Those words were balm for every blistered hand and sleepless night. Over the years, I tried to teach him that wealth wasn't counted in dollars but in memories. I took him camping under a million stars, taught him how to track deer through the forest, and showed him the joy in feeding hungry birds from his hand. He learned to say, "Thank you," for every sunbeam and noon breeze. He watched Marjorie greet neighbors with homemade pies and me greet friends with a cold handshake and a warm grin. And for so long, it worked. There was laughter around our dinner table, sometimes too loud, and debates about politics or the best way to shuck corn. We argued, sure, but we always resolved it before the dishes were done. Respect was a two-way street, and we all walked it carefully. But if I peer back now, I can see the first cracks. The day he refused to help fix the barn door. The time he laughed off my offer to teach him how to tie a proper fishing knot. His apologies grew shorter, his departures earlier. I chalked it up to growing up. Every parent worries when their child steps into the world alone. And so I savored each sunrise, each shared meal, each quiet evening on the front porch. I immersed myself in the good years, believing that our bonds, fortified by decades of love, would carry us through any storm. I pictured my son carrying on our traditions, teaching his own children the same lessons of honor and kindness. I couldn't have imagined that the very strength of our past would one day be used against me. The years of sacrifice and love set the stage for an even deeper pain, one that would begin with subtle shifts and silent betrayals. I began to notice the cracks in our relationship when my son turned 25. It wasn't a single thunderbolt of betrayal but a slow, persistent drip of indifference. One evening, I called him on his cell, our old Sunday night ritual, and he answered with a distracted, "Yeah, Dad," as if I were interrupting something far more important. The warmth in his voice felt thin. At dinner, he'd sit at the head of the table, thumbs flicking across his smartphone screen while we ate. He rarely asked about my day anymore. Instead, he scrolled through emails or texts from his fiancée, and I watched the glow of the screen paint half his face in electric blue. "Pass the gravy," I'd say, and he'd toss it over without making eye contact. Once, when I laughed at a silly memory from Marjorie's old joke book, he barely smiled. I felt a pinch in my chest, but I swallowed it down, reminding myself that he was busy, building his career, planning his future. His fiancée, sweet when I first met her, began to echo his disregard. At my birthday barbecue last summer, she stood by the grill with her arms folded, surveying the yard like it was a backdrop for her Instagram feed. When I complimented the grilled corn, she sipped her wine and smiled politely, but her eyes drifted back to the poolside lounge. I caught her whispering to my daughter-in-law's sister that she couldn't believe I still lived in the sticks. I saw the corner of her mouth twitch with amusement. Then came the first outright dismissal. I offered to drive my son and his fiancée to the city for a date night, my treat, as I used to take Marjorie on drives when the roads were empty and the radio played old love songs. He shook his head. "No thanks, Dad. We'll Uber." His refusal wasn't about the ride, it was about the principle of asking for help. Back then, he never would have turned down my company. I felt the sting of rejection, but I smiled and said, "Suit yourselves." Inside, though, something tightened like a rusted bolt. Money began to change hands in new ways. He asked me to cover the little extras, car insurance, the occasional dinner, without so much as a "thank you." Embarrassed, I tucked receipts into my coat pocket and listened to his casual, "Don't worry about it," as he pocketed his wallet. I tried to remind myself that it was just a phase. Young couples always felt strapped for cash before they got their footing. But my savings dwindled faster than I expected, and every bank statement felt like a silent reproach. "You have enough, you're supposed to help. The final straw, though, was harder to name. It came in the form of a text he sent me one afternoon. "Hey Dad, I'm not going to be home for dinner tonight. Out with friends. Sorry." I read it twice, pressing my thumb against the cold screen. It wasn't the cancellation, it was the brevity, the lack of apology. No, love you, no, see you tomorrow, nothing to bridge the space his absence carved in the air. I ran my fingers over the dried roses Marjorie had pressed in a book, and I wondered when we had become you. I journaled my unease in the evenings, something I never did before. Page after page filled with descriptions of his distant posture, her curt smiles, my growing ache. I even wrote a note on my calendar, June 12th, call local handyman about porch railing. It wasn't life or death, but I needed something concrete to focus on, some task where effort yielded results. Dealing with my son's coldness felt like chasing smoke through my fingers. One Sunday, my neighbor Mrs. Patel stopped by with a pie. She'd known us since my son was a toddler and had watched him grow bolder every year. Over tea in my kitchen, she leaned forward and said, "I hate to see you like this, John. He's a good boy, but he's losing sight of where he came from." I nodded, tears pricking. I didn't want pity, I wanted a bridge back to him. But all I could do was slice the pie and offer her a seat. That week, I tried to reconnect in small ways. I baked his favorite chocolate chip cookies, ours were lumpy, gooey, each one unique. I left them on the counter with a note, I remembered. He came home late, peeked at the note, shrugged, and took 2 cookies to go. "No, thanks." I closed the door behind him and sat on the couch, holding the empty plate like a failed experiment. I began to wonder if I'd done something to push him away. Had I been too strict when he was a teenager? Too sheltered? My mind replayed every scolding word I'd ever spoken, every boundary I'd drawn. But when I remembered the boy who rode his bike bareback on country roads, the boy who fell asleep to our lullabies, I knew those rules had protected him, not limited him. Financial dependence took on a darker hue when he asked again, this time for a loan to help pay his impending mother-in-law's medical bill. I felt torn. How could I turn away someone who'd once put his life in my hands on that first bicycle ride? Yet I sensed a pattern, that every request chipped away at the respect I'd earned. I offered instead to help him set up a payment plan with the clinic. He snapped, "I need cash, Dad. You worked all your life, why not help me now?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp as shattered glass. I said no, and he slammed the door on his way out. Late that night, I stared at the ceiling. I thought of the man I was before children, a proud tradesman, a determined builder. I still was that man, I still had the same hands, the same steady heartbeat. But the son who'd once looked at me with trust and wonder now looked through me. And it wasn't just him. His fiancée, my daughter-in-law, whispered to her sister that capitalism had made me obsolete, an old-fashioned relic. I told myself not to show weakness. I returned to my routines, waking before dawn, tending the fields, repairing the fence posts. But my footsteps felt heavier. I hummed the same old tunes Marjorie used to sing, but her voice in my memory sounded faint, distant. I found myself glancing at our wedding photo on the mantel, where we stood on our wedding day, so young and hopeful. My unease grew into a cold knot in my chest. The future I'd pictured, retiring on the porch with grandkids at my feet, passing on tales of starry nights, slipped through my fingers like the last grains of sand in an hourglass. I told no one, but I felt it, the shift in power, the shift in love. And I realized that when respect dissolves, only one thing remains, revenge or surrender. I wasn't ready to surrender. But I'd soon learn how far he would go to push me aside, and how far I would have to go to reclaim my dignity. The quiet unease of these early signs would soon give way to a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. The Sunday the betrayal happened is burned into my memory like a scorch mark. My son and his fiancée invited me to celebrate their engagement at a brunch in the town's new bistro, a place I'd never stepped foot in before. I saw it as a chance to reconnect, to breathe life back into our strained bond. I pressed my best suit, polished my shoes until their leather gleamed, and clipped a sprig of marjoram from the garden, my mother-in-law's favorite herb, to tuck into my pocket like a good luck charm. Inside, the exposed brick walls and humming espresso machine felt foreign. Guests mingled over mimosas, and I searched the crowd for familiar faces. My son spotted me first, waved, then turned away without a word. His fiancée swept over, all bright smiles, and kissed my cheek. "So glad you're here," she said, but her eyes flicked to her phone as she spoke. I nodded, setting the sprig gently beside the table centerpiece, a pristine orchid in a glass cylinder, an image of their polished new life without me. During brunch, the waiter approached with a silver tray. "Mimosas?" he asked my son. My son glanced at me, then back at his fiancée. "We'll have two," he said, and didn't offer me one. I watched the bubbles rise in their glasses, a private toast I wasn't invited to share. When the waiter passed by again with artisanal pastries, I reached for an almond croissant. Before my fingers touched it, his fiancée swooped in and claimed the last one, murmuring, "Thanks, Dad," to my son as though I were invisible. Pain twisted in my chest. I forced a polite smile. "Excuse me," I offered quietly, "I thought I might try one, if you don't mind sharing?" She blinked, then raised a perfectly plucked brow. "We have plenty at home," she said, voice crisp. "Enjoy what's here, please." She turned away and returned to her phone. The table erupted in hushed laughter at some inside joke. No one looked at me. No one offered a pastry. I felt my pulse thud in my temples. A red sting of humiliation. I glanced at my son, hoping for rescue, for a glance of apology, but he was already animatedly recounting their trip to Paris last month. They showed off photos, croissants dusted with powdered sugar, the Eiffel Tower twinkling at night, and my heart sank lower with each slide. The sense that I belonged faded like steam off a hot cup. As the brunch wound down, the host couple called for toasts. Glasses clicked, and the crowd cheered. My son raised his flute, but all I heard was the hollow echo of his words, "To our future." He caught my eye for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to catch the faint discomfort there, before he looked away. His fiancée squeezed his arm, and they drank. I raised my own glass of sparkling water, though I am certain they didn't notice. Afterwards, they posed for photos by the window. I hovered at the edge of the frame, but the photographer didn't ask me to join. My son and his fiancée turned to the camera, lips parted in perfect smiles, arms entwined, as though they were the only two people in the room. I lowered my gaze to the street below, where pedestrians strolled without a care in the world. A part of me longed to disappear. I stood to leave, but the waiter intercepted me with the bill. My son reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and laid down a card, no word of thanks, no seat saved for me in solidarity. I dug into my jacket pocket and handed over a crumpled 20. He took it, nodded, and swept past me into the bright afternoon sun, leaving me with the bill's faint imprint, subtotal, $86.50, service charge, included. Just another transaction, I thought, as though I were a stranger who'd stumbled into a scene that didn't belong to him. Walking back to my truck, I felt every bruise on my heart. I passed the old hardware store where I bought Marjorie's favorite paint, the butcher shop where our son once refused a hot dog for being too greasy. Every familiar landmark echoed with childhood laughter now swallowed by the present's cold indifference. I fumbled for the sprig of marjoram in my pocket. It was wilted, its fragrance faint. I pressed it against my cheek, tasting its bitterness. That night, alone in the kitchen, I laid the sprig on the counter beside the orchid petals that had fallen from their vase. I remembered how Marjorie used to dry marjoram under the windowsill, how she'd rub the leaves between her fingers to stir our son's imagination. I remembered how my son used to climb onto my knee, wanting to help snip the stems. Now, he looked at marjoram as though it were a weed. A flashback seized me, my son at age 6, grinning through missing front teeth as we burst into laughter over a botched magic trick. His small hands reached for mine, trusting and sure. And here I was, a man crippled by that same innocent trust, rendered powerless by his callous grown-up world. I ended the night by shuffling through our old family albums. Photos of fishing trips, of scraped knees mended with kisses, of Marjorie's gentle smile framing every moment. I turned the pages slowly, as though each one were a prayer. The betrayal of today cut sharper against the backdrop of those memories, proof that the boy I raised with care had become a stranger in his own past. In the weeks that followed, I withdrew from the world around me. I stopped attending my son's weekend visits, citing a back flare-up. I passed on neighborhood barbecues, saying I had chores to catch up on. Inside, though, I was mourning more than a relationship. I was mourning the loss of the respect I'd given freely, the trust I'd lavished without hesitation. The whispers from neighbors, "I hear his son's treating him poorly," were a bitter solace, but the truth stung. Respect once broken seldom heals on its own. By the time I rebuilt my fence posts and repainted the porch, the wound had become a hollow ache. I learned that betrayal isn't always a grand gesture. Sometimes, it's a series of small rejections that accumulate until there's nothing left of what once bound you. I tucked the orchid petals into a book and threw away the sprig. Their beauty meant nothing now. And so I settled into a silence heavier than any argument. My heart, once bursting with pride, now carried a shadow, a quiet vow that I would not fade away without asserting my worth. The next step, I knew, would be the hardest, confronting the betrayal head-on. The moment of betrayal would set into motion a reckoning neither of us would forget. I never imagined I'd become a secret in my own home, whispered about in hushed tones behind closed doors. The betrayal of brunch was still raw when I sensed something darker brewing, a clandestine scheme I couldn't ignore. It began with odd silences whenever I entered a room. My son and his fiancée would pause mid-conversation, their laughter dying on their lips. When I asked what they were discussing, they exchanged a glance too quick for comfort. Then came the day I found the letter. I'd gone to the study to retrieve my reading glasses and noticed an envelope, unsealed, its flap tucked under a stack of bills. I recognized the lawyer's letterhead. My heart hammered. I slid the envelope free and unfolded the crisp stationery. The letter outlined intentions to petition for guardianship, citing concerns about my ability to manage finances and daily care. It detailed plans to move me into a senior living facility and to remove me as executrix of my own estate. Anger surged, hot and blinding, but I folded the letter and pocketed it. I needed proof, something concrete before I confronted them. Over the next days, I watched. I listened. I started taking notes in my journal, dates, snippets of conversation, overheard words like nursing home and contest the will. One evening, I caught my son on the phone, pacing in the kitchen. "Make sure Dad's unaware," he whispered, voice low. "We'll have everything in place before his next checkup." He paused. "No, don't tell him. He'll only make a scene." I sank into a flashback, Marjorie and I, years ago, sitting at the very same kitchen table, laughter dancing in our eyes as we planned our garden for spring. She had laid her hand over mine and said, "Promise me we'll always share everything, no secrets." I remembered the softness in her voice, the trust in her gaze. Now, that trust lay fractured like the cracked saucer Marjorie dropped years ago. I told myself to remain calm, that panic would only play into their hands. So I kept tending to my routines, mornings in the garden, afternoons on the porch swing, while my mind churned with strategy. I enlisted subtle allies. One afternoon, I ambled over to Mrs. Patel's house with a plate of fresh-baked cornbread. As we sat on her porch, I casually mentioned the letter and watched her eyes widen. She squeezed my hand. "You deserve better than whispered plans and hidden letters. Let me know if you need me to come with you to the doctor, or the attorney." Buoyed by her support, I pressed on. I visited my old friend and notary, Mr. Caldwell, under the guise of updating my living will. He peered over his spectacles when I mentioned possible family disputes. "John," he said, "I remember drafting your first will, so full of love for your son and loyalty to Marjorie. If there's any chance it's being challenged, we need to talk safeguards." He tapped his pen thoughtfully. "A no-contest clause might deter frivolous claims. Shall we?" My hands shook as I signed new paperwork. Each signature felt like a drop of armor sealing around my heart. I asked Mr. Caldwell about costs. "We can manage," I said, forcing a steadiness into my voice. A part of me felt guilty. After all, this wasn't the son I'd held in my arms, the little boy who trusted me with every secret. But another part of me burned with the need to protect myself, my legacy, and the memory of Marjorie. That night, I returned home to find my son perched by the fireplace, laptop open. He gave a curt nod. "How was your day?" he asked without warmth. I swallowed the letter I'd drafted to my lawyer, the one requesting a full copy of our trust and a list of every beneficiary change. I replied evenly, "Fine." I stopped by Caldwell's office. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask why. I realized then they assumed I was too old-fashioned to fight back. In the following weeks, I noticed menus from assisted living facilities tucked between cookbooks on the kitchen counter. There were brochures for power of attorney forms scattered on the coffee table. Their scheme was bold, deliberate, and carried out right under my nose. I felt a surge of betrayal so fierce it made my knees weak. Knowing I'd been targeted by my own flesh and blood turned every memory bittersweet. I thought back to the day I sat my son on my knee to teach him how to tie fishing knots. He'd squinted at the line and muttered, "Why learn that? I'll just buy a tug and go." He was joking then, but somehow that offhand remark had foreshadowed his growing impatience with my ways, my life's work. One afternoon, I confronted my son quietly in the garden as he pruned the roses I'd planted for Marjorie's birthday. Thorn pricks stained his gloves crimson. He froze when I appeared beside him. "I know what you're planning," I said, voice low but firm. He looked away, his hands tightening on the shears. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. His fiancée emerged from the house and, upon seeing our faces, hurried back inside. I left him to his pruning and walked away, feeling the weight of his denial as keenly as the scar on my knuckle from the last rose bush we planted together. I realized then they believed my age made me obsolete, too feeble to notice or respond. I saw in their actions not love, not concern, but greed and entitlement writ large. That night, I lit the candle by Marjorie's portrait. Its flame trembled in the stillness, casting dancing shadows across the room. I laid the executor papers in front of me, the ones naming me as the primary trustee, and traced the embossed seal with my fingertip. I whispered to the empty room, "I will not be pushed aside." In the dark, I made a vow, I would not let their clandestine plans stand. I would not surrender my home, my voice, or the life I built with skin and sweat. If they wanted war, I would meet them head-on, with legal might, unwavering resolve, and the memory of every sacrifice I ever made. And I would start by rewriting the terms of my world, on my own terms. Have you ever felt betrayed by your own family? Let us know in the comments. The morning after I confronted him in the garden, I woke with a resolve as sharp as the winter air. I knew my son would deny everything, he always did, but I needed concrete answers. Over breakfast, I slid my coffee cup across the table and met his gaze. "I spoke with Mr. Caldwell about the trust," I said evenly. "He's drafting the no-contest clause and updating the beneficiaries. I'd like you to read it." His fork clattered against the plate. He set it down and crossed his arms. "Dad, I don't need to read your legal papers." He sighed, as if I'd asked for something petty. "Just let me handle things." I leaned forward. "No, you'll read it. You'll see that I've made my wishes clear. If you challenge it, you'll lose everything." His eyes flickered, surprise? Anger, and he opened his mouth, but his fiancée's voice reached us from the living room. "John, we're late for brunch." She appeared in the doorway, immaculate in a silk dress. My son rose reluctantly. He glanced at me, lips pinched, then walked out without another word. In that moment, I realized he no longer saw me as his father. I was an obstacle, an inconvenience. My threats, once unthinkable, now seemed to amuse him. That evening, I visited our longtime neighbor, Mr. Ruiz, whose handyman expertise I'd called on countless times. Over a mug of tea, I told him the full story, every secret letter, every brochure for assisted living, every denied request for respect. Mr. Ruiz frowned. "Son, they're treating you like property." He tapped the tabletop. "You've been the backbone of this town. Don't let them paint you as incapable." He paused, then added gently, "If you need to stand your ground, I'll testify that you manage your affairs just fine." Buoyed by his support, I returned home and crafted my own confrontation. I didn't want to raise my voice, I'd promised myself to stay calm, but I wanted him to know I'd reached my breaking point. That night, in the mellow glow of the living room lamp, I showed him every piece of evidence I'd collected, the lawyer's letter, the facility brochures, his own words recorded in my journal. He leaned back on the sofa, arms draped over the cushions. "This is insane," he said, voice low. "You're blowing everything out of proportion." I held his eyes. "Then explain why you asked Dr. Lawson to check on my memory last week." His face paled. "He said you'd mentioned being forgetful." He clenched his jaw. "I was worried about you." I swallowed. Worried enough to plan my removal? Worried enough to strip me of my rights? He stood abruptly. "I'm not going to argue with you now." He turned toward the door. I rose too. "No," I said, voice firm. "We're going to talk this out." He froze. For a heartbeat, I caught the faint tremor of fear in his eyes. His fiancée slipped in behind him, placing a hand on his arm. "Let's go," she whispered. But my son stayed rooted to the spot. He met my gaze once more. "You're making me choose," he said. "And I'm choosing my dignity," I replied. He stormed past me, slamming the front door so hard the glass rattled. His fiancée lingered, her lips pressed tight, then she too went out, leaving me alone in the silent hall. I exhaled, a fierce relief washing over me. For years, I'd bent to keep the peace. But peace at the expense of self-respect was no peace at all. I crossed to the mantel and picked up the framed photo of Marjorie and me on our wedding day, her eyes bright, my smile hopeful. I laid a single marigold beside it, its petals soft and real, a reminder that authenticity mattered. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle shifts. The mail carrier lingered at my gate and offered to bring in the packages. The butcher left a free rib roast on my porch, for an old friend. Mrs. Patel invited me for tea and scolded me gently for letting my son walk all over me. Each act of kindness was a stitch in a new pattern, one woven by people who truly saw me. My son tried to connect again that weekend, sending a text, "Can we talk?" I read it twice, then typed back, "Yes." Wednesday at 5. In my study. I didn't add, or not at all. I'd learned that sometimes firmness speaks louder than open arms. When Wednesday arrived, I sat at my desk, papers neatly arranged, the updated trust, copies of my deposition notes, and a letter addressed to my son. It was both invitation and warning. I would speak honestly, no accusations, just truths, and I would listen. But I wouldn't waver this time. He arrived on the dot, his shoulders tight. He cleared his throat as he stepped in. For a moment, we regarded each other in silence, two men shaped by the same blood but estranged by years of neglect and ambition. "I'm sorry," he said at last, voice raw. "I never meant to hurt you." I nodded slowly. "I know you didn't see it at first." But actions speak louder than intentions. I gestured to the documents. Read these. Then tell me where we go from here. He hesitated, then sat. The papers trembled as he turned the pages. I watched the lines on his face soften, the tension in his shoulders ease. He looked up at me, eyes glistening. I thought I knew what was best. I reached across the desk and placed a hand on his. I want to believe that. But you have to show me. He swallowed and nodded. I will. That dinner, we talked late into the evening, not as father and spoiled son, but as two men trying to rebuild a bridge. I listened to his fears, his pressures, and he listened to mine. I didn't know if we could restore what was lost, but I knew we'd crossed the line where silence reigned. That night, words returned, and with them, a fragile hope. The limit had been reached. But on the other side of that boundary, there lay the only path forward: truth, accountability, and the willingness to fight for love's respect. What began as a quiet resolve had become an open challenge, and neither of us would back down. I arrived at Mr. Caldwell's office on a crisp morning, the late August sun casting long, golden shafts through the tall windows. My heart hammered in my chest like the press of his old printing press when I first set type as a teenager. I carried my leather briefcase, lined with notes, drafts, and scribbled reminders, as though it were a shield. Mr. Caldwell, his silver hair gleaming under the skylight, greeted me with a warm nod. "John," he said, "I'm glad you came in today." I settled into the high-backed leather chair, smoothing the front of my shirt out of habit. He laid out sheaves of paper, the existing will, the trust documents, and the proposed amendments. "We'll draft a codicil," he explained, voice gentle but firm. "It removes your son as primary beneficiary and names the community fund you've supported for decades. We'll also add a no-contest clause: if anyone challenges this will, they forfeit all inheritance." A knot twisted in my stomach, guilt and resolve wrestling beneath my ribs. I pictured my son, eyes wide with hurt when he read the changes, and I remembered the sting of his shrugs and dismissals. But this was no whim, it was protection. I placed a hand over the top sheet. "Let's do it," I said, voice steadier than I felt. He slid over a fresh page. "Sign here, here, and here," he instructed, his fountain pen glinting. Each signature felt like a nail hammered into a coffin, my relationship with my son, sealed by ink and paper. The final signature went down in a bold flourish, and I exhaled, the tension of weeks bleeding out in a single breath. Once the formalities were done, Mr. Caldwell closed the documents and looked at me with compassion. "This will change more than your estate," he said quietly. "It will send a message." I nodded. "It has to." On my drive home, I passed the high school football field where I'd once coached Friday night games. I saw the empty bleachers, ghostly in the afternoon light, and remembered the pride in my son's face when he scored his first touchdown. My throat tightened. I flipped the codicil open on my lap and reread the no-contest clause. In the event any beneficiary, heir, or other person invalidly contests or initiates proceedings to impugn this will or any of its provisions, then any share or interest in my estate given to that person by this will is revoked and shall pass as though that person predeceased me. I ran my fingertip along the words and felt the finality of them. They were a promise to myself: no more silent betrayals, no more whispered plans behind my back. That evening, I lit the lamp in my study and sat at my desk, where a framed photo of Marjorie smiled back at me. I poured a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light like a small flame, and sipped slowly. Memories washed over me: the day we stood in a courthouse, fresh-faced and in love, her laughter echoing under the high ceilings; the night she stroked my hair in the hospital, whispering that I was strong enough to carry us both. I reached for a blank sheet of stationery and began to write a letter to my son, not knowing if I would ever hand it to him. I wrote of my love, of the pride I'd felt for his first steps, his first words, and of every sacrifice Marjorie and I had made so he could chase his dreams. I wrote of the sorrow I felt, that our bond had frayed beyond simple repair, and of the necessity of my actions. "My son," I penned, "I wish it had not come to this. But after the plans I discovered and the words you spoke, I have little choice. This will is not about punishment, it is about ensuring that my life's work continues to serve those who honor it. I hope one day you understand why I did this. But until you show me the respect worthy of a father's trust, this is how it must remain." I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, alongside the final will and codicil, a silent testament to both love and resolve. That night, sleep eluded me. I replayed the lawyer's office in my mind, the scent of aged wood and leather, the echo of pen on paper. I wondered if my son would ever forgive me, or if this act would drive him further away. But I also felt a flicker of peace. At last, I had taken control of my destiny. I would not leave my home, my savings, or my legacy in the hands of someone who regarded me as obsolete. Over the following days, neighbors and friends greeted me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Mrs. Patel slipped me a handwritten note that read, "Bravery comes in many forms. You are never alone." Mr. Ruiz dropped by with a basket of peaches and a promise to help around the house whenever I needed. Their support reminded me that a life built on integrity and hard work did not vanish because one relationship had soured. As autumn leaves began to fall, I placed the codicil in the safe deposit box I'd shared with Marjorie, now mine alone, alongside our marriage certificate and her favorite scarf. Locking it, I felt the weight of the keys in my hand, a tangible barrier against further betrayal. At home that evening, I stood in the hallway outside my son's old bedroom, now empty, the walls bare, and placed a single plastic daisy on the threshold. It was the same kind he had given me on that birthday brunch, the one that had marked the start of this long reckoning. I knelt, picked it up, and set it in the trash. Then I straightened and walked away, the echo of its stem hissing as it slid down. In that act, I felt something shift. The power to hurt me, to disregard me, now lay not with him but with me. And I would not squander it. With the will written, the codicil signed, and my resolve steeled, I turned toward the next phase of reclaiming my life. I did not know what would come, whether my son would challenge the will, whether we would ever speak again. But I knew one truth, would stand firm, uphold my dignity, and honor the love that had built our home. The bastion of legal protections was in place. Now, I would prepare for the confrontation that would either cement my peace or ignite the final storm. The morning sun slanted through the bedroom drapes as I sipped my coffee, savoring its warmth. I'd slept soundly for the first time in weeks, buoyed by the knowledge that my will and codicil were safely tucked away. But peace proved fragile. A sharp knock on the front door shattered the quiet, and I found my son standing there, face tight with indignation. He held a thick envelope stamped urgent in bold red letters. "Dad," he began, voice clipped, "you need to sign this." I took the envelope from him. It listed a new set of demands, that I agree to transfer the deed of my house into his name as co-owner, or face eviction proceedings. If I refused, the letter threatened, he would seek immediate possession through the courts. Below the typed demands, in my son's handwriting, he'd scrawled, "Sign by Friday, or I'll turn off utilities." I felt the coffee cup tremble in my hand. Eviction? Turning off the heat and electricity in late October? The morning chill already nipped at my bones. But more than that, the audacity of the threat, the willingness to weaponize our shared home, cut deeper than any insult. "Is this really how you think we resolve things?" I asked, calm but hollow. "By holding my home hostage?" He shrugged, as though shrugging off his own flesh and blood were no more consequential than mailing a package. "I'm only protecting my interests." I closed my eyes and drew a slow breath. This house is my life's work. I built it, every board, every nail. It isn't collateral for your demands. His fiancée stepped out onto the porch behind him, arms crossed and gaze cool. "We're being reasonable," she said. "You signed legal documents, now you need to comply." "Reasonable?" I echoed. Is it reasonable to threaten your father's well-being? To gamble with his safety in winter? He glanced down at the envelope. I don't want to do this, Dad. But you've left me no choice. I wondered when love had become a zero-sum game, where one person's gain demanded another's loss. I remembered the day I lowered my son into the baptismal font, promising to guide him in life's most sacred rituals. Now, he held my home ransom. I stood and folded the letter. No, I said simply. His jaw clenched. Then we do this the hard way. He handed me a second envelope, this one from the power company, with a final warning: service would be disconnected within 48 hours if the bill wasn't paid. But I knew it wasn't about an unpaid invoice, it was leverage, a blunt instrument to bend my will. I watched him square his shoulders, preparing to walk away. I opened my mouth to plead for mercy, for the son I once knew, but found only a hollow ache in my chest. I closed the door in their faces. The sound reverberated through the empty hallway like a judgment bell. Inside, I leaned against the door and closed my eyes. My house, my sanctuary, had been turned against me. The walls that held a half-century of laughter now echoed with threats. I thought of Marjorie's gentle hands smoothing the curtains in this very room, her humming lullabies that once made every corner feel safe. The memory brought tears, but no regret. If threats were the language they chose, would answer in kind, not with spite, but with dignity and defiance. By afternoon, I'd packed a small satchel, essential documents, my journal, a few changes of clothes. I didn't know where I would stay, perhaps the guest cabin at Mrs. Patel's, or the bench by the community center. But I refused to cower. I left a note on the dining table addressed to my son. I will not be bullied out of my home. If you choose to force my hand, you leave me no alternative but to take legal action. I have given you every chance to show respect. Now you must decide whether you value our relationship more than leverage. I signed it simply, Dad, and clipped it to a magnet on the refrigerator. Then I walked through each room, touching the mantel where family photos stood, the bookshelves where I'd placed Marjorie's favorite novels, the kitchen counter where I'd taught my son to stir pancake batter. Each touch was a promise, would not abandon this place. When evening fell and the power flickered once, I lit every candle I owned, tall tapers in the living room, votives on the windowsill, lanterns by the front steps. Their warm glow painted dancing shadows on the walls, infusing the house with life even as the grid faltered. I sat in my favorite armchair, its leather worn and imprinted with my shape, and read by candlelight. The next morning, while my son and his fiancée slept, I drove to the county courthouse. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the steering wheel, but I felt a fierce calm. In the clerk's office, I filed a complaint, an injunction to prevent eviction and utility shut-off, a notice of my objection to their demands, and a request for mediation. I handed over copies of my will and codicil, demonstrating that I had every right to remain in and maintain the property. The clerk nodded, stamping each page. I left the courthouse with a stack of stamped documents and a new sense of agency. The threat of winter without heat no longer loomed as an insurmountable terror. The law, once foreign jargon, had become my shield. That afternoon, I returned home to find a business card from a young attorney taped to my front door: "If you need further representation, call me. I work weekends." No name, no message, just the card. I took it inside and placed it by my reading lamp. A silent ally in a silent war. When my son called that evening, voice unsteady, I answered. "I see you filed at the courthouse," he said. "I documented your threats," I replied calmly. "They won't stand." There was a long pause, then a sigh. I don't want to go to court." "Then withdraw your demands," I said. "Come talk to me without ultimatums." He hesitated. "I'll think about it." I closed my eyes, letting the tension ebb from my shoulders. The final straw had nearly broken me, but instead it taught me that dignity is worth standing up for, even when the cost is steep. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, and I leaned forward to blow out a candle. In its dying ember, I saw the flicker of the man I'd been, strong, unwavering, and ready to protect what mattered most. The storm had arrived. But I was no longer standing in its path, I was the calm at its center. The night of the community fundraiser felt like the perfect stage. They'd rented the town hall, long rows of folding tables draped in white cloth, a buffet of casseroles and pies, string lights overhead. It was the same event I'd sponsored for years, handing out raffle tickets and greeting neighbors with a firm handshake. This year, I arrived unannounced, manuscript folder tucked under my arm, heart pounding like a war drum. I greeted the mayor, who offered me a nod that turned to surprise when he noticed the tension in my shoulders. "John," he said softly, "good to see you." I managed a curt smile, then moved toward the buffet line, where my son and his fiancée were chatting with friends. Their laughter rang hollow in my ears. I paused a few feet away, watching them, the way his fiancée's hand rested lightly on his arm, the way he gestured with ease, as though I weren't there. I inhaled, tasting cinnamon and fried chicken from the buffet, then stepped forward. My son's eyes flicked to me, a jolt of recognition and panic passing through them. "You're here," he said flatly. His fiancée turned, surprised, and offered me a tight smile. "We thought you weren't coming." "I'd never miss this event," I replied quietly, placing the legal folder on the buffet table beside the chafing dishes. The silver lid rattled, drawing curious looks. I opened it to reveal my will, the codicil, and a stack of printed emails outlining their attempted guardianship scheme, the eviction threat, and the utility shut-off notice. I watched as murmurs rose among the guests, neighbors whose opinion mattered more now than ever. "Is this a joke?" my son whispered, stepping forward. "You're embarrassing us." I raised my voice so everyone could hear. "I'm not embarrassing anyone except those who think it's acceptable to bully their own father." Heads turned, forks hovered mid-air. I pointed to the codicil. "This document is my final word on who inherits my estate. If you challenge it, you forfeit everything." His fiancée gasped, clutching his arm. "You can't do this, these were private family matters." "Nothing private about threats," I said. "You want my home? You threatened eviction. You want my money? You tried to strip me of my rights." I tapped the eviction notice. "You sent this." The guests leaned in. I saw the baker from down the street purse her lips, the pastor clear his throat uncomfortably. A hush fell. I took a deep breath, letting the silence amplify their shame. I built every board of that house with my own hands. I paid for every brick, every shingle. And I taught my son that respect and gratitude were the cornerstones of any relationship. I turned to my son. "What happened to that lesson?" He swallowed, his jaw working. I got busy. Life got complicated." "Busy?" I echoed. "Busy enough to plan my removal? Busy enough to mock my memory? Busy enough to hold my heat and lights hostage?" My voice cracked, and I pinched the bridge of my nose, blinking back tears. I looked at their circle of friends, the couple who ate at my table each year, the teacher who once praised my son in class, the neighbors who waved from their porches. I saw confusion, pity, solidarity. "I don't want to fight you," he said quietly, voice catching. "I just wanted to look out for you." I shook my head. Looking out for me doesn't mean planning to send me away or strip me of my dignity. Protecting me means caring for my wishes, even when they conflict with your desires. I closed the folder and held it against my chest. "This stops tonight." He glanced at the guests, then back at me, raw regret in his eyes. "Dad." I held up a hand. "No more apologies until I see action. Actions speak louder than words." I folded the folder and snapped it shut. "If you withdraw your guardianship petition, the eviction notice, and the utility complaint by tomorrow morning, we'll start over. I paused, letting that sink in. If you don't, we go to court. A tremor ran through him. His fiancée looked torn, leaning into him. I saw the fight in his eyes, the guilt, the fear of public shame. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he whispered. I'll withdraw them. I exhaled, relief and sorrow mingling in my chest. Then let's begin rebuilding. As I closed the hall's front doors behind me later that night, I heard murmurs of support, a neighbor calling, "Thank you for standing up," and felt the weight of their eyes. The confrontation had been brutal, but necessary. I'd chosen dignity over silence, action over neglect. In the emptiness of my car, I leaned back and allowed myself a single moment of vulnerability. My son's voice echoed in my mind, "We'll start over." I prayed he meant it. Do you think the father made the right choice? Comment and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true life stories. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the hush of my once cozy home, now feeling strangely cavernous. The echo of my footsteps on the hardwood floor sounded like a judge's gavel, delivering its verdict at every turn. I paused in the foyer, breathing deeply, trying to steady the flutter in my chest. Outside, the late autumn twilight gathered in blue shadows. Inside, the emptiness felt almost tangible. I set my coat on the hook by the door and wandered through each room. The living room's armchair sat undisturbed, its leather cushion still warm from my earlier reading by candlelight. The kitchen table bore the faint outline of the letter I'd clipped there, a silent testament to the ultimatum I'd issued. I pressed my palm to its surface, willing myself to feel something other than relief mixed with heartbreak. In the hallway, I passed the study where I'd confronted my son. Papers littered the desk, court filings, eviction notices, notes in my own handwriting. I gathered them into a neat stack and placed them in my briefcase, as if storing away the weapons of war. The documents felt heavy, but so did the burden they relieved. I closed the study door gently, as though setting a seal on that chapter. Outside, the town buzzed with muted gossip. Through the living room window, I saw Mrs. Patel tending her late-blooming chrysanthemums, pausing to glance in my direction with a sympathetic nod. Across the street, Mr. Ruiz loaded wood into his truck, presumably for the winter, then tipped his cap and offered a small wave. These quiet gestures of solidarity filled me with something like warmth, even though the furnace had yet to be turned back on. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried it to the front porch. The chill in the air bit at my fingertips, but the steam curled up around my face in comforting tendrils. I wrapped my scarf tighter and sat in the rocking chair where Marjorie and I once planned spring gardens. The chair groaned under my weight, as if acknowledging the heaviness in my heart. I rocked slowly, listening to the faint rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. The silence settled over me like a blanket, uneasy, yet restorative. For weeks, my mind had raced with anger, fear, and indignation. Now, the stillness offered space to think without the noise of threats or counter-threats. I realized that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the moment after the storm when the air smells fresh and unbroken. I thought of my son, lying in his own home that night, wrestling with regret. I wondered if he paced his kitchen as I had, debating whether to pick up the phone. I did not know if we would truly start over, but I felt certain that the path forward began here, in honest reflection rather than silent compromise. After dusk, I decided on a night walk. I pulled on my boots and strode down the gravel lane toward the creek. The moon, a pale sliver, guided me with its borrowed light. My breath came out in clouds, and with each exhale I let go of a fragment of tension. I paused by the old oak where my son and I carved our initials decades ago. The bark had grown over the letters, but I could still trace the outline with my fingertips, proof that time moves on, healing as it erases. As I turned back, I saw a small figure waiting near the front gate, my granddaughter, Lily, bundled in her pink coat and holding a thermos of hot chocolate. She ambled over and handed me the cup, her cheeks rosy and eyes bright with concern. "Grandpa," she said, "Mom told me you might be upset. I made this for you." Her gesture struck something tender and fierce in me. I knelt to her level and brushed a stray hair from her forehead. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, voice catching. I sipped the chocolate, savoring its sweetness and the warmth it brought. She slipped her hand into mine, and for a moment, I felt the simple reassurance of being seen and loved. We walked back together, our steps in sync. She chattered about her school play, about her cat's mischief, about the crayons she'd used to draw our family. Her innocence felt like a healing balm to the wounds left by adult betrayals. At the porch steps, she gave me a quick hug. "Call me if you need me," she whispered. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the house settle. The furnace had clicked back on, sending a soft hum through the vents. I closed my eyes and pictured the creek under moonlight, the oak tree's scarred bark, Lily's outstretched hand. The silence after confrontation was not emptiness but possibility, a chance to rebuild trust, to strengthen bonds that mattered most. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether my son would truly follow through, whether our relationship would heal or fray further. But I awoke the next morning with something I hadn't felt in months, a quiet certainty that I had reclaimed my dignity and my place in this life. The silence was not the end of our story, but the pause before its next chapter. The morning after Lily's surprise visit, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The dawn's first light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the walls. I stretched in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the furnace, and thought, it was time to breathe new life into this house, Marjorie's house, and my own life along with it. Over my chipped porcelain mug of coffee, I sketched ideas in my journal. On the first page, I wrote, turning this home into a haven for those who need it most. Beneath, I listed possibilities: a small bed and breakfast for traveling veterans, a weekend guest room for visiting grandchildren, a monthly tea for widows in town, a workshop space for local artists. The list grew like seedlings in spring. I decided to start with something simple: convert the unused guest bedroom at the end of the hall into a temporary respite for veterans passing through. I remembered Mr. Ruiz's stories of how he'd served in the same battalion I had during Desert Storm. He'd mentioned once how isolating civilian life could feel after you left the service. I grabbed my jacket and headed next door. He was tinkering with his truck in the driveway. When he saw me approach, he set down his wrench and offered me a grin dusted in grease. "Morning, John. Everything okay?" I held up my journal. "I've got an idea, thought you might help me figure out the logistics." I explained how I wanted to open the guest room as a free lodging for veterans in need of rest or a place to heal. His eyes shone. "That's a beautiful idea. But you'll need permits, insurance, maybe volunteer help." "I know," I said. "I'm willing to learn. I wanted to start by asking you, would you be on my advisory team? You know the veterans community better than anyone." He laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. "If you'll have me, I'm in." Our first task was to clear out the guest room. Later that morning, Lily bounded down the stairs, half awake but eager to help. "Grandpa," she said, rubbing her eyes, "you need an assistant?" I ruffled her hair. "Always." Together, we carried old photo albums, suitcases filled with outdated clothes, and dusty board games into boxes for donation. Lily chattered about which quilt we should keep and what color to paint the walls. Her enthusiasm lifted my spirits, and by noon the room was empty except for a single twin bed and a small writing desk. In the afternoon, I called my lawyer's office. Mr. Caldwell had once reminded me that a proper liability waiver and a brief homeowner's policy update would be necessary. His assistant, Claire, picked up the phone on her second ring. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson. How may I help?" "Claire, it's John. I'm planning to host veterans for short stays, nothing commercial, just a charitable service. Could you set me up with any legal forms or paperwork I'll need?" She paused thoughtfully. "We can draft a volunteer lodging agreement, Add a rider to your homeowner's policy, and I'll email you a checklist for occupancy permits." "Thank you," I said, gratitude warming my chest like a hearth fire. By sunset, Lily and I had repainted the guest room in a soft sage green, Marjorie's favorite, and hung a framed print of the forest path we used to hike. I tacked up a small sign, "Welcome, veteran, this room is yours." We stepped back to admire our work. Lily beamed. "It's perfect, Grandpa." That evening, I sat on the porch swing with Mrs. Patel, who came bearing a plate of cinnamon snickerdoodles. She rocked beside me, hands folded in her lap. "I heard you and Mr. Ruiz talking," she said. "About helping veterans?" I nodded, taking a cookie. It felt right. This house has walls that once held laughter and sorrow, in both extremes. I want it to be a place of healing now. She smiled. "And it will be. You've built more than a home, you've built a legacy." Over the next week, Mr. Ruiz gathered contact information for local veteran support groups, and I met with Reverend Kim at the church, who offered to spread the word in his newsletter. Lily volunteered to design flyers at school. My son even dropped by one afternoon, hesitant, and found me measuring bed linens in the guest room. He looked around at the freshly painted walls. "What's all this?" he asked softly. I pointed to the sign. "A new plan." He ran a hand along the desk. "For veterans?" I nodded. "For veterans, for my granddaughter, for anyone who needs a place to belong." I paused. "I'd like you to help, if you want." He swallowed. I think I'd like that." A flicker of relief and pride warmed me, but I let it pass without comment. Instead, I said, "I'm glad." By the time autumn ebbed into early winter, word had spread. The first veteran arrived, a quiet man named Carlos, who'd served in Afghanistan and was passing through town to visit a former commanding officer. He spent 2 nights in the guest room, and each morning, he joined me and Lily for coffee and pancakes in the kitchen. He shared stories of distant deserts and midnight watch fires, and I listened with reverence. One evening, as I closed the house behind us after Carlos left, I paused in the hallway where the empty guest room door stood ajar. A soft glow from the reading lamp inside spilled into the hall like an invitation. I touched the doorframe and felt my heart swell. This house, once shackled by betrayal and pain, was alive again, pulsing with purpose. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, where Marjorie's portrait still gazed down lovingly. I knelt before it, placing my hands on her frame. "We did it," I whispered. "We're still building something good." As I turned out the light, I knew this was only the beginning. The new plan, born from loss and tempered by hardship, had given me a purpose that outlasted any bitterness. In that moment, I felt Martha's first morning light filtered through lace curtains as I carried a tray of cinnamon oatmeal down the hall to the guest room. Carlos, the veteran who'd stayed that week, sat on the edge of the bed, lacing his boots. He looked up and smiled, a quiet, genuine curve of gratitude. "Thank you for this," he said, voice steady but soft. "Really." Moments like these reminded me why I'd embarked on this new path. My son's betrayal had cut deep, but it also pushed me to build something far more enduring, a family forged not by blood alone, but by shared trust, respect, and kindness. Over the next few weeks, the guest room saw a steady trickle of visitors. There was Marisol, a nurse at the VA hospital who needed a weekend away from relentless night shifts, and Tom, a widowed schoolteacher seeking solace after his wife's passing. Each arrived uncertain, clutching a suitcase, eyes scanning the room as though expecting a trap. But when they saw the framed forest print and smelled the fresh lavender sachets on the pillow, their shoulders relaxed, just enough. Lily took to her role as junior hostess with delight. She'd place a small bowl of matchbooks and pens on the nightstand, then dash down to set the dining table with mismatched china she'd scavenged from the attic. When I watched her quietly arrange spoons, I felt a swell of pride. This was her grandmother's legacy coming to life through my granddaughter's hands. Our circle grew organically. One afternoon, Mr. Ruiz brought over a wooden crate of heirloom apples from his orchard. "Figured you could use these for pies or cider," he said, hands dirty from grafting branches. Across the street, Mrs. Patel delivered a basket of hand-sewn blankets. "For guests who feel the chill," she smiled, her eyes crinkling. Word spread through the community like spring grass pushing through frost. At Sunday services, Reverend Kim mentioned the guest room in his sermon on hospitality. On Tuesday mornings at the cafe, regulars nodded knowingly when my name came up. Even the mayor stopped me in the town square to shake my hand, praising the remarkable initiative and praising the spirit of small-town generosity. Yet what warmed me most were the relationships that formed under my roof. Carlos returned one evening for our weekly veteran circle, where men and women in uniform from different eras shared stories, jokes, and condolences. They sat in a half-circle around the hearth, feet up on footstools, casting long shadows in the firelight. It struck me that they were as much family as I'd ever had, linked by shared sacrifice and mutual understanding. One crisp evening, as Tom recounted a memory of his late wife's laughter echoing through their home, Lily crept into the room and laid her head on my knee. I stroked her hair and caught Tom's eye. He offered me a small, grateful nod. I realized in that moment that what I'd built wasn't just a guest room, it was a haven. My son watched from the doorway that night, hesitant, as though deciding whether he belonged. He'd been helping me clear snow from the walkway, unasked, but present. After the circle broke up, he lingered by the hearth. I set down my cup of tea. "You're welcome to stay," I said simply. He looked at me, uncertain. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course." He settled onto the arm of a worn leather chair. "This," he gestured to the empty seat beside me, "this feels right." I nodded. "I'm glad." He hesitated, then swallowed. "I should have done this sooner." I didn't reply, no need for words. The crackle of the fire filled the space as our chosen family drifted out into the snowy street, leaving us by the hearth. Over the following weeks, true bonds formed. We held potluck dinners where everyone brought a dish, a mix of casseroles, curries, and vegan stews that filled the table with color and laughter. On Fridays, Lily and I hosted a story hour for visiting grandchildren who piled onto the rug, wide-eyed as we read from my battered copy of Charlotte's Web. On Saturdays, I led a morning walk to the creek, where neighbors and guests gathered to breathe fresh air and share silent camaraderie. One evening, after a lively game of cards around the dining table, Marisol looked around and said, "I never knew my hometown had this many good people." Her voice trembled. "Being here, it's like coming home." I felt tears prick my eyes. That's exactly what I hoped, for this to be a home for anyone who needs one. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle changes in my son. He no longer answered my calls with curt, "What's up?" but with genuine questions. "Need help with wood stacking?" or "Do you want me to sweep the porch?" He asked my advice on menu planning for our potluck, consulted me about possible repairs, and even laughed at jokes from the veteran circle. But even more poignant was the warmth of this new family, people who chose to be here, who respected my home and honored Marjorie's memory with every step. They carried blankets, chopped firewood, planted bulbs in the garden for spring, and learned to stir pancake batter just so. They remembered birthdays with borrowed blooms from the garden and toasted my health with local honey mead. One afternoon, I found a small card slipped under my door. In neat handwriting, it read, "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still lives in the world. Sarah, class of '82. Sarah had been a student I coached in those early Friday night games, now grown and traveling through town. Her note sat beside the wooden crate of apples on the kitchen counter, a testament to the ripple effect of genuine generosity. That night, I stood on the porch as snow fell in lazy flakes. Lily nestled in my coat pocket, watching the world transform in white. Together, we looked at the soft glow of the guest room window, a beacon in the winter dusk. I thought of the son who'd handed me a cheaper-than-cheap plastic daisy, of the betrayal that pushed me to my limits, and of the will that set my boundaries in stone. I thought of the legal battles and the burned bridges. And then I thought of this, of the laughter echoing down the hall, the chorus of voices singing away loneliness, the gentle clink of teacups after midnight conversations. Here, in the home I built with my hands and my heart, Real family lived. Not perfect, but persevering. Not bound by blood alone, but by shared humanity. I squeezed Lily's hand and whispered, "This is where I belong." And for the first time in months, I fully believed it. A week after the grand opening of our guest room's winter season, I settled into my favorite armchair by the fire with a mug of hot cider. Snow drifted against the windows in lazy flakes. The house hummed with the soft murmur of guests talking in the next room. My son's footsteps on the hardwood floor pulled me from my reverie. He entered quietly, coat in hand, and paused in the doorway, as though weighing whether to come closer. His shoulders were squared, but his eyes held an uncertain weight. I set my mug down and folded my hands in my lap. "I wanted to see you," he said softly. The crackle of the fire punctuated the silence that followed. I gestured to the empty chair across from mine. "Sit, please." He moved hesitantly, brushing snowflakes from his coat. "I drove by last night, saw the lights in the guest room. Everything looked so alive." He paused, voice catching. "I'm proud of what you've done." I nodded, letting the warmth of his words settle between us. "Thank you." He stared into the flames, then turned back to me. "I've been thinking about everything." He swallowed. "I'm sorry, for the way I treated you. For the threats, for the scheming behind your back. I can't undo it, but I've felt," his voice wavered. "I've felt the shame." I leaned forward. "What matters is what you do now." He closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his tone was steadier. "I spoke to the attorney today. I withdrew the guardianship petition, the eviction threat, and the utility complaint, just as you asked." A relief flickered in his expression, quickly replaced by something more vulnerable. "I know I can't expect forgiveness overnight. But, I want to help. I want to earn back your trust." A memory surfaced, the day he lost his first front tooth, and we scraped the wax seal from a sticky envelope to reveal $1 the tooth fairy had left. He'd looked at me in awe, as though I'd performed magic. Now he looked at me with a humility I'd never seen before. I studied his face, lines of regret and resolve etched in equal measure. "I appreciate you doing that," I said quietly. "And I appreciate your apology. But trust is built over time." He nodded, head bowed. "I understand." I gestured toward the hallway. "Come with me." I stood and led him past the guest room door, its light glowing warmly. I opened the door and motioned inside, where several veterans were gathered around a small table, playing cards and exchanging stories. They glanced up and offered polite nods. "This," I said, voice hushed, "is what I wanted you to see." He stepped in, eyes widening at the scene, old uniforms draped on chair backs, laughter mingling with the shuffle of cards, mugs of tea on a side table. A veteran named Clara looked up from her hand of poker and smiled. "Good to see you, sir," she said kindly. He managed a small smile. "Thank you for letting me visit." I watched him approach the table, pull up a chair, and introduce himself. He struggled momentarily with the rules, then joined in with genuine enthusiasm. I lingered in the doorway, pride swelling quietly in my chest. When the game ended, he walked over and handed me a folded envelope. "It's for you." I opened it to find a stack of photographs, snapshots of guests leaving handwritten thank you notes on the kitchen counter, of Lily tucking blankets around a weary nurse, of Mr. Ruiz guiding a veteran through the garden gate. Beneath each photograph, my son had scrawled a caption, "Their smiles say everything." He swallowed. "I wanted you to know what your dream became." I held the photos to my heart. "You've done more than apologize. You've seen the value of this work. He looked away for a moment, then met my gaze. I still hope we can have family dinners again. Real ones. My throat tightened. I'd like that, I said. But they must be based on respect. I understand. We sat by the fire in companionable silence, watching embers drift skyward. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, but inside, the hearth kept us warm. Before he left, he hesitated at the door, then turned. Dad. Happy birthday. He reached into his pocket and handed me a small, handcrafted wooden box. Inside, nestled on a velvet cushion, lay a single, meticulously carved wooden daisy, its petals smooth and lifelike. I stared at it, feeling the gentle weight of his effort. It's beautiful. He smiled, relief softening his features. You deserve something real. I placed the box on the mantel beside Marjorie's portrait, the wooden blossom joining the wildflowers she once tended. Thank you, I said, voice thick. He nodded and stepped out into the winter night. I heard the soft crunch of snow under his boots as he walked to his car. Before the engine started, he looked back, hand raised in a small wave. I returned it, knowing that while forgiveness would take time, a new chapter had begun. I closed the door and sank into my armchair. The house seemed full again, with possibility, reconciliation, and chosen family. That night, as I stirred the embers in the hearth, I whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, for the strength to stand my ground, for the courage to start anew, and for the single carved daisy that symbolized an honest, hopeful future. Have you ever felt betrayed by your own family? Let us know in the comments.